Okay, welcome back, everybody. We are still going and going strong. We've had a great day, some great presentations. I don't think we've had a bad one yet, Linz. Wouldn't ever
not.
expect it out of all of these great presenters. So this has been amazing.
It has been, yes. And we're going to round out the day strong. We have 2 presentations to go. I wish there were more, but I understand that it's Friday and, there are families and work and food to get to and things like that. But it's been an honor to listen and to learn from the presenters so far today. And I'm excited to do the same thing these final 2 hours.
Yep, exactly. And thanks, everybody, for joining us on a Friday once again. And if for those of you who don't know me, who haven't been sticking with us the whole day, I'm Brett Norton, and the conference is rounding out an exciting couple of weeks, starting with SPX 2021, which was a virtual vendor expo that we launched last week, Monday and Tuesday. And that was a very exciting kind of invasion into the social media space, so to speak. And we had vendors all across various different platform offerings and providing a lot of new and innovative ideas and technologies that really found their way into our space. And it was a great way to introduce these new innovative products. So in case you missed any of that, please visit beyondclean.net/SPX 2021 for new product announcements and more education. You can always go back in and check it out. So I'd like to once again take a moment to thank our event sponsor, 3M, for helping make this day of education possible. It's like we said earlier, it's been a great day. It's been fabulous as far as the educational content, and we are excited to share it with everybody. And now on to our presenter. Melissa Morgan is the Director of Infection Prevention in the Adventist Health System. She has over 10 years of experience in infection prevention and over 5 years in sterile processing and distribution. Melissa has served as the president of APIC in North Carolina. She's also been recognized for many industry awards, including a fellow of the Association of Professionals in Infection Control and Epidemiology in 2017. She participates in several forums across the country to influence and drive infection prevention and sterile processing measures. Infection prevention is here are 4 words every sterile processing professional secretly dreads. Melissa is on a mission to change this response, and rightfully so. Melissa will discuss the role of infection prevention in sterile processing and highlight key strategies for relationship building between departments. She will also discuss the complex nature of sterile processing workflows and offer suggestions for leveraging infection prevention resources for process improvements. So without any further ado, let's kick it off to Melissa.
Hi, thank you. I super appreciate being able to join you guys here today. Thank you so much for that introduction, Brett and Lindsay. It's still morning time here in California, so I appreciate you guys on the East Coast and the central parts of the country continuing to tune in. So let's get started, and hopefully I can entertain and share some knowledge with you today. So infection prevention is here, oh no, and everyone scatters to the wind. I do want to share that I do have nothing to disclose, but I would also like to give a shout out and acknowledge that many of the pictures that you will see of sterile processing technicians and team members will be from my time at Cone Health, and I appreciate that team and the knowledge and experience that they taught me. So I just wanted to acknowledge that before I got started. So I know that Brett shared a little bit about who I am, but how did I get to infection prevention? I really started as a paramedic and spent 14 years in that space which taught me a lot about patients and patient care. Before becoming a nurse and starting out in the neonatal intensive care unit, which I absolutely loved my time there, and then got the opportunity to venture into adult intensive care and medical surgical nursing. But in 2010, I really found my love for infection prevention and got the opportunity to join the team in Greensboro at Cone Health. 2018, I became the system director for both infection prevention and sterile processing at Cone Health, and that included 8 operational sterile processing departments. In the end of 2019, I had an opportunity and joined the Adventist health system on February 18th, 2020. And if any of you recall or can't forget, as a lack of a better term, COVID was right on those heels. And we initially began to get a lot of information about COVID, and at Adventist Health, we got our first COVID patient on March 17th, 2020. So a little bit about Adventist Health as a system. We have over 20 hospitals. I believe we're at 26 hospitals right now with more than 250 clinics and over 4,000 providers. We cross much of California up and down through Northern and Southern California, but also have facilities in Hawaii and Oregon and clinics in Washington. So we're a very large system with a lot of footprint, but we do have small facilities within that organization, and many of these patients that come to our facilities are from rural health. So today, I really want to focus on what is the history between the relationships of infection prevention and sterile processing. I want to discuss strategies for relationship building and how we can be together to do process improvement successfully. And really, amongst that conversation, talk about the complex nature of sterile processing, the workflows, and how infection prevention can play a positive role in developing that business case for sterile processing. So here we have a sterile processing sink with a technician hard at work. And on the outside, we say, wow, they're in good PPE. They have a 3-bay sink. Things are clean. But then we start digging into, my animation is not working. I apologize. So then we start to dig into the details, and you can see that things are not quite as clean and pristine as we first thought. There's towels here for what reason. That sink is extremely full of water. And what are these guys doing back over here at the washers? And so we really have to dive into those details because there are so many details in sterile processing. The type of personal protective equipment that they wear, how you do and perform hand washing of instrumentations, how you load automatic washers, the inspection that must occur during assembly that ensures the adequate use and function of instruments, the very intricate and detailed instructions for use that exist for every piece of instrumentation that we have, and then how we store things. And then, of course, what we always call document confusion, because there's so many logs and pieces of paper that we must keep up with in order to ensure that we are safely providing sterile instruments. So why is this a big deal? Well, in Joint Commission, the infection prevention or infection control, as we have previously been called, has its own chapter. And I'm sure all of you are very familiar with the IC standard 020201, which says that we as a hospital will reduce the risk of infections associated with medical equipment, devices, and supplies. And then specifically under that IC standard is EP2, performing intermediate high-level disinfection and sterilization of medical equipment, devices, and supplies. And so I'm sure all of you have heard this standard and hear this standard, and it just makes your skin kind of stand on edge, because although this is one simple statement, there are so many levels that ensure that we are compliant for safety. And in 2018, Sylvia Garcia Hutchins of the Joint Commission, who is a certified nurse and certified in infection control, reported that 72% of surveyed hospitals and critical access hospitals were found to be non-compliant with this standard 020201. So of course that makes us wonder, what can we do and how do we prevent having safety issues? Because that's what this totally boils down to, right? Although this is a regulation, the premise behind this standard is that we are keeping patients safe. So with 72% of hospitals being non-compliant, that raises serious red flags for me as a person who may be experiencing health care. And so there's been a real big push amongst regulators and infection preventionists to really focus on several key areas around instrumentation. And I'm sure some of you can even think about times where you've had to do action planning around this. So what is occurring at the bedside with wipe and flush of point of use as needed? Almost every instrument that we have needs to be cleaned at the point of use. How do we maintain that moisture of the soiled instruments from the time that they get utilized until the time that they end up in sterile processing or in a high-level disinfection area to be cleaned? In that, how do we transport these instruments safely? Because they are considered biohazard with the bioburden. How do we ensure that sterilant reaches all surfaces? Many of these instruments are extremely complex, have various levels with very small details that need to be cleaned. So how do we ensure that that is occurring? And then how do we ensure that we carefully release instruments after sterilization? Are they allowed to cool appropriately? And then how do we store them? And then also, how do we store items that have undergone high-level disinfection, ensuring that they are stored appropriately as well as dried before putting into storage? So I like to talk about the things that are similar between infection prevention and sterile processing and those that are different. So for me, I like to believe that I look like Wonder Woman. I'm sure as you look at my screen, you can tell that I do not wear a cape, nor do I have a tiara. I would like to one day fix that. But at this time, I feel like I play a role to come in and really help teams do better. And I'm sure sterile processors love to think about the complexity and the detail that goes into their areas, how their areas are kept organized and neat. But we also know that the general public views us differently, right? So the title of my slides is Infection Prevention is Here, Oh No. And that's because most of the time, infection prevention is seen as the police, or I also refer to this as the hand hygiene police. And that's really not what I do, but that's what people associate with infection prevention. And unfortunately, there's another similarity that sterile processors have to face and deal with, and that is people compare you to dishwashers. And what you do for a living is so much more complicated than what a dishwasher does. Although I do want my dishes to be clean, the level of cleaning and time associated with that looks very different from what you do in your career. And so what does the background of most infection preventionists who now visit your sterile processing look like? And so when we review some of the literature, back in 2015, the Association of Professionals in Infection Control, also referred to as APIC, performed a survey of more than 4,000 infection preventionists, looking at what their diverse backgrounds would be, because we knew we were having to get into spaces that we typically did not in previous life. It was not uncommon for infection preventionists to never go behind the red line and for you to really avoid them unless something really bad had happened, and that was never a good sign. So as we looked at what the history and background of our IPs were, 82% of them are nurses. And nursing does range across various types of nursing, but historically more in the medical surgical range, ICU range, or emergency department. 10% of infection preventionists are laboratory scientists, and 5% have worked in public health. So you can see that that education and background is very, very different than working in a sterile processing space. And so when you look at how an infection preventionist spends their time versus the way a sterile processor spends their time, it looks different as well. So IPs spend the majority of their day performing surveillance and investigation. And so that can be looking through patients' charts or comparing culture results. It's a lot of nitty-gritty details, and it requires a vast knowledge of definitions for ensuring that we are applying the same standard across our facilities. Whereas a sterile processor spends a lot of time doing a lot of manual work. Here you can see a sterile processor and an assembly table where they are testing instruments before assembling them in a tray. The work requires you to test, inspect, assure that it matches what is required for the physician to do their practice. And if this piece goes wrong, a surgeon cannot adequately perform surgery. So this is a very important role and job. And in the infection prevention range, looking at and preventing infections is also equally as important because we keep patients safe on the other side of that. And so since infection preventionists have a varied knowledge and background, how do we help them get into a space that they are not familiar with, nor do they know the details? And in a few years ago, the Joint Commission actually released a booster pack that provided some nitty-gritty details on how, as an infection preventionist, we can understand the work that occurs in sterile processing and hopefully prevent any gaps in our practices to make sure that patients are safe. And so each one of us got this checklist to say, hey, now I can go into sterile processing and know how to help them. And then we go into sterile processing, and this is kind of what we see. And that looks nothing like that previous checklist. This checklist is a lot of statements with boxes, but I'm going to sterile processing and I am seeing sinks and chemicals and instruments and washers and equipment. And so what does that really mean? And in my head, there starts to be questions. Why is this so pink? Why are these instruments still dirty? Why are there so many layers in this washer? And this is what happens. The bomb goes off, everybody's face turns red, and we have to figure out how to fix these things together. So how does sterile processing get to where they are? Well, we know many, many years ago, at least 2000 BC, that our ancestors recognized the importance of disease transmission and actually took steps to prevent infection. As early as 500 BC, we know that Egyptians boiled water and wine to use as disinfectants when trying to solve an infection or when they were removing body parts that may have experienced diseases. And so although we are much more advanced than water or wine, it still took until the 1700s for folks to kind of figure out that microbes could be killed by utilizing heat. And that was by a fellow named Spallanzani. But even though he did some groundbreaking work, it took another 100 years or more for this theory to be taken seriously. And it really was a foundation of infection prevention, but also helped launch some methods in sterile processing. And that was by Semmelweis, who was a Hungarian physician that noted that medical students were transferring diseases on their hands because they not only worked in labor and delivery, delivering babies, but they also worked in the morgue when there wasn't a baby that needed to be delivered. And he noted that they were moving back and forth from those two locations without cleaning their hands, and subsequently had significant mortality in both mothers and babies after not hand washing from the morgue to L&D. But then, based on that work of those two historians, in 1880, Charles Chamberlain invented the first steam sterilizer. And sometimes I can still find equipment that looks very familiar to this type of box or drum. And if you open your sterilizer doors and look at this drum sideways, it probably still looks very familiar. And the steam sterilizer itself has not had to evolve very far as the actual mechanics, but the work and the processing that we do because of the continued evolution of instrumentation and the alternative medical technologies that are currently being explored and expanded on to treat patients do require us to really dig in and understand how these instruments and that processing of steam sterilization work together. And then you have development of brand new facilities that really align the work to try and eliminate and streamline the carriage of instrumentation to reduce the stress and ergonomic pull on the employee, to try and create efficiencies in workflow. So there is so much complication in the history of sterile processing to get us to where we are today, but we can still continue to build and influence the relationships. And so when we look at sterile processing, historically, the management of sterile processing usually falls under two different realms: the operative services or materials management. Many of you know operative services is the revenue center for the hospital. They focus on key metrics such as turnover, how long an OR case takes, and how many cases they can deliver per day, because that directly equates to the bottom line. And then most operative services are run and driven by nurses and function under standards by ARRN. In material management, we know that you manage the dollars, not the materials. They focus on metrics around high cost, right materials, right quantities, and right time. They are very business driven and function under another professional organization, AHRMM. And these things can influence their management and oversight of sterile processing. And in those operational challenges, many times sterile processings are forced to look at their volume-based productivity, how they are staffed hierarchy-wise, and how many layers there are. Typically in an OR or materials management layer, there are several layers of leadership, where sterile processing departments can be a small subset or a few individuals who work there. So how do you have various levels of leadership? Education and experience in the sterile processing realm from an operative services and materials management perspective looks very different, and managing those expectations can be difficult. And you really need to respect the knowledge of a sterile processor and what that sterile processor brings to the table. And so when we think about sterile processing and how sterile processing should be managed, many times the comparisons are to OR cases. And if you've ever worked in sterile processing or spent any time down there or behind there, wherever they tend to be located, OR cases tend to be in the hundreds when you look at a month or a couple of months. But when you look at trays processed in a sterile processing department, they're way up into the thousands. So the amount of and body of work that sterile processors do is enormous compared to one case, because we know one OR case can require 20 instrument trays at a time. So how exactly do we utilize infection prevention to influence change and adopt standards? One big key that I try to tell infection preventionists is you have to spend time in the department. You must be humble to understand their work and understand your role in helping support them in that work. You have to ask the questions. You have to come from a level of seeking to understand and knowledge. And anybody who's worked with me previously knows that one of my common questions is, can you help me understand? Because this seeks to understand and not present a standard or an expectation that I, as an infection preventionist, know, but I need to get down to the level of the sterile processor to understand the why. And I always try to be a part of the solution. How can we partner together? What things do sterile processors know is not quite right in their job? And how do we get together and make that happen? And here is an example of when sterile processing and infection prevention came together to really think about their work. And as I spent time in sterile processing, one of the common themes is how dirty people felt when they left decontam. Although they were wearing PPE, they felt like that space was just never at a level that was super clean, despite how much cleaning they did. And so really partnering with that team, we brought in ultraviolet disinfection. This engaged the sterile processor with a solution that they could implement and see results. And it was extremely powerful, empowered the team, and empowered me as an infection preventionist to understand how important infection prevention really is to sterile processors. And when you do that, you really begin to build relationships. Relationships are key when we want to partner to drive solutions. If I come in and tell someone how to fix something, I have not gotten their engagement. I have failed to acknowledge their knowledge and understanding of the job that they do every day, and have really come in with a top-down approach. But when I come in side by side with a sterile processor and spend time to understand why they do what they do, to understand the dynamics of what they know is difficult in their job, I can help leverage my position in the hospital to drive it better. And so you get smiles on the faces of the sterile processors when you come. They're open and willing to share more knowledge. And then you get to celebrate their big wins, such as when they have been with an organization for many years, as many sterile processors have. And processing takes time. This is not something that is a short win or can be done quickly. And when an infection preventionist gets behind that red line in sterile processing and spends some time, they understand how many steps are truly involved with instrument and instrument cleaning. They can help by performing time studies that when you follow an IFU step by step, this is how long it takes to process and clean an instrument tray. Otherwise, you have someone telling you that this should not take this long and you should be able to push out this many trays in this amount of time, because they don't truly understand the importance and engagement that is related to the IFU. You can establish some standard work to help eliminate any waste in your processes. Many times as a sterile processor, we don't have what we need where we need it. And so there's a lot of walking and roaming around trying to find things, whereas someone like an infection preventionist can come in with a higher level view and stand back and look and say, you know, if you need these chemicals here, can we put them here? And if we can't put them there, where can we put them so that you don't have to spend so much time looking and hunting for things? You can declare together what measures of success look like as a team. You can get together and say, you know, if we want to do our IFU steps, how do we measure that and ensure that this practice is standard? And then you get to celebrate together. And then you get to partner to validate what standard work for a leader would look like and what that standard work would look like for an infection preventionist, so that we're always attuned to identifying gaps in our practices, but also understanding and recognizing the importance that the actual sterile processor may bring to a process. The team may have developed work, and once that work gets into motion, coming back and evaluating how that work continues to flow. Change is inevitable, and so there is forever a change in products or instrumentation or physicians that may have changed the practice. So it's always key to continue that knowledge seeking and hearing the feedback from the team on what exactly that work looks like, and does it need to continue to modify and grow and change. And when you learn together, you can establish what that work looks like. And then I have pictures to go with my checklist. I can adequately see that this is how my sink is supposed to be set up. This is what my sterile processor should look like. And I can easily identify when there's gaps in those practices that might not make it as easy for the processor to perform the job, or that we've actually skipped a step as we look at our workflows. And this can be very valuable for the team because it really creates this environment of conversation. And conversation is so key when you take groups from different backgrounds in making sure that they understand each other and can ask clarifying questions. We've gotten so engaged in emails and text messages that oftentimes the subtle messages of a face-to-face conversation, although right now that would be a masked face-to-face conversation, so would have to learn to read your eyes, can really go a long way to ensuring that you have not created an issue or complicated a matter by hearing both parties. And always make it visible. The one thing that hospitals do well is put up flyers, but how important and visible is that information? Does it mean something to me? So a lot of times it's important to make things color-coded. Red meaning I haven't done this, green meaning I have. But also, can we do that with other processes, such as when something is coming from one area to another? It's very common for us with biohazard containers or even case carts now to use a red and green methodology. But I will share that you have to be very careful about how you make things visible and the colors you use, because we know that across our dynamic that we have people who are challenged with colors. And so we really need to make sure that not only are the colors understood and easily identifiable, but also that the language we use is not complex and that anybody can understand it. We tend in healthcare to use big fancy words or abbreviations, and sometimes people just do not feel empowered enough to ask for an explanation or understanding of those actual meanings. And so always remember that when you are talking to others, to really explain what you're meaning, or to read the body language or ask questions when the people look confused. But how does infection prevention increase your visibility? Well, I would say that I feel like I have always been a pretty visible infection preventionist. Am trying to engage with the teams I work with. But I think that if anything, COVID taught us that we need infection prevention in our lives. Infection prevention in a hospital is very regulated across both state and federal bodies, as well as independent accrediting bodies. And so they are often chapter owners of information that is key to the hospital's payment processes. And so having them as a partner increases that visibility just from that connection. And infection prevention is truly everybody's responsibility. So if infection prevention is down in sterile processing and helps them understand that they are key in these methods and empowers them to drive change, they really can make a difference for your facilities. Infection prevention is very connected with executive levels all the way to the staff level, and so they can use that connection and relationship to help bring issues that are faced by sterile processing departments to a level of that sometimes cannot be seen outside of the operating room or materials management, but from more of a safety perspective and not a fiscal perspective. And then all infection prevention reports must go to the board of the hospital as a part of the CMS quality indicators. So those elements alone bring important influence and opportunity for teams to see sterile processing as an important part of the hospital and really a foundational step in what infection prevention and sterile processing together can do. And when you partner for visibility and improvement, you can really share that improvement across the board. This is just a brief example of some work that was done at Cone Health around increasing errors or opportunities with tray preparation, not necessarily associated with dirty instrumentation, but many different errors outside of even the IP realm, such as wrong instruments or missing instruments. And you can really get and share that improvement all the way up to the board level. That really takes sterile processing's importance up a notch within the organization. And you can also support and brag about the financial impact of that partnership. So not only did we see that dramatic graph that showed the decrease in really our errors, you can just see over that period of time how much impact that really had, but then you can also help by sharing and supporting the financial impact of the partnership. So when you look at the numbers, you can really break it down to a fiscal implication. So if you look before, there were 577 trays with errors. That took 3.7 hours to process. And if you took the average pay at the time of $12.50 an hour, and it cost 2,136 hours of rework, costing the organization almost $27,000 of just rework and time away from providing care to a patient, versus after the improvements, that dropped to $8,000. So even though that looks like a small change in the big scheme of things, because sometimes that amount of money can only buy about one instrument, it really does drive the point that the partnership between infection prevention and understanding the work and the influence can really help sterile processing in driving change and improving patient safety, which is ultimately their goal. And of course, that savings of $18,000 is hard green dollars that you can relate to change, as many of us, even before COVID, were articulating and trying to pull together how each individual department could save money. This is definitely an opportunity to use those process improvement elements to display cost savings efforts. And of course, this relationship and partnership, it takes one bite at a time. You have to come at it from both sides. We both have to be open and ready to dig in and put the work behind us, but together we can really see some success and change in a department that is fundamental to patient safety and sterile processing. So I will, at this time, open it up to questions and answers.
Okay, great. Melissa, thank you so much. That was wonderful. A lot of great information in there. And I, of course, have, worked in tandem with infection preventionists in many different hospitals and come up with some really good solutions across the continuum of care and, various departments that have really helped drive just the, various adoption of the practices that you really would like to get across to the hospital teams. So I have a couple.
I'm going to just
Yep.
One more little anecdote. I was in a hospital earlier last week here in Minneapolis and spoke with the sterile processing supervisor about how instrumental infection prevention was in making sure that pre-treatment of instruments happened successfully, happened consistently. And they said that infection prevention was really the driver behind that initiative. So shout out to all the IPs out there really working hard to help both the OR and sterile processing with best practice.
Yeah, and to that point, Lindsay, just to jump in, I wanted to say that a lot of times that process often starts as infection prevention driving it, but it really on the back end helps the sterile processor, because when those instruments are moist and transported appropriately, man, does it make that work at the sink so much easier.
Absolutely.
So,
yes.
Really, as much as we kind of harp on sterile processors for doing that decontam right, if they don't get the instruments in a level of moisture, their job is so much harder than it would be. So I am so glad that so much attention has been placed in that area.
Agreed.
Yep, for sure. Yeah, I've always used the analogy of, when you have the dried soils on the instruments, it's almost like dried eggs on, a nonstick pan. It's, you get it into the sink and it's just a nightmare to get it off. So,
absolutely.
Yeah, it definitely reduces the time spent at the sink. So why don't we hop into some questions here? First one, let's see. How often does your IP inspect SPD?
So I will tell you that I think that there is an opportunity to partner with sterile processing more than maybe the 2 times a year infection preventionists have historically shown up in sterile processing to complete what I call environment of care rounds, where they come in and really serve more like auditors. So for me, I believe that an audit or an environment of care round should happen at least twice a year. However, I think the infection preventionists should be in sterile processing much more than that. One, to understand what barriers that they see in their work, and to also make sure that things are working for when sterile processing, such as receiving instruments. So I can tell you that the work from getting instruments clean and moist down to the SPD, that would require you going to see your sterile processing departments probably once a week to make sure that that process stays intact, because we're all challenged with short time. And so for me, I would like for all sterile processing departments to be visited once a month at a minimum by infection prevention, and more from a partnership perspective and not so much as an auditor or an inspector.
Yeah, I can agree more. That's, wonderful. Let's see. As an IP, do you recommend CBSPD or ISHIM certification?
So I am a huge proponent for infection preventionists to actually get educated and take that certification. I'm also a huge proponent of that certification amongst sterile processors. Not because it makes you perfect, but because it lays some of the foundational elements to what the work is and why certain things are important. I feel like many times we don't know why we do something, and so when I vary from that or take a shortcut, it's no big deal because I don't know why I'm doing it anyway, and we're always asked to do more work at a time. So I think that both of those bodies can really lay foundation. But then, much like I tell infection preventionists, 50% of it you can learn and get certified in. The other 50%, you have to do the work. And you have to understand the work. And so I think those two things have to go together.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's see here. What's the best piece of advice you've given a sterile processing professional, and what's the best piece of advice you've received as an IP?
So the best piece of advice I have received as an infection preventionist was not to use slang terms when it comes to sterile processing. Sometimes people will refer to sterilization as cooking, and nothing that is done in sterile processing is similar to a kitchen. So we're not cooking anything. We are sterilizing instruments. And so I think that from an IP perspective, that helped me understand that there's a long history of lack of identification of sterile processors as a profession and as a choice to help patient safety. And so for me, just hearing that conversation helped me think about how I approach them differently and how I use and respect them as individuals and the importance of the work they do. The advice I would have for sterile processors is don't run from infection prevention. I know it's scary when we come because we tend to always find something, but as an infection preventionist, that's not a bad thing if I find it. The thing is that we can then work together to see how we fix it so that it doesn't become a bad thing for the patient. And I can't figure that out if I don't really understand what's not right in the process, and that's where the sterile processor really has the answers.
Melissa, I love what you just said. Both of those points are, I think, critical, especially the advice that you were given as an infection preventionist. I think we can all, as an industry, take that advice. Even as speakers on the speaking circuit. Oftentimes we see speakers who have been in the industry for a really long time. Some of those terms, some of that jargon is just kind of bred into them because of how long they've been in the industry. And what was interesting, the last in-person event that I was at, there was a term used, I don't even remember which term it was, but it was kind of one of those slang terms that you were mentioning. And one of the newer techs that I was sitting by was like, what does that mean? So there's an opportunity to eliminate those slang terms from the language that we use, and in doing so, elevating the industry as a whole. So a huge learning opportunity for, something I'm taking to heart as someone who does some speaking engagements and hosting of these events, is to really pay homage to really the level of professionalism, the level of skill that it takes to be a sterile processing professional, and making sure to use the appropriate language to describe the tasks that are carried out. So great point.
And I can tell you, when I was a paramedic, sometimes I would get referred to as an ambulance driver. And I thought, wow, that is not what I do. And so even as a nurse, when I worked in the NICU, people would call me a baby nurse. And what I did was so much more complex than rocking babies. That has really carried through with me in my career. And so just having that conversation, I was like, duh, Melissa, if you don't use the technical terminology, you're actually really undermining that person and the smarts and knowledge and detail that they pay attention to do their job.
Absolutely. Let's see. Another question here. Can you provide some examples of how infection prevention can influence change and adoption of standards across hospital departments so they work in tandem with sterile processing to implement a team-based approach to patient safety and infection prevention?
So I think there's a couple of ways to get at that. One thing that I'm a huge proponent of, and I would really like many more organizations to take a real hard look at, is how we are actually structured. I mean, I get the organization under operative services or even materials management, but that leader of that sterile processing department needs to be at the table when decisions are made. So things like when they decide to bring a new surgeon on who wants a certain type of equipment, they should be at the table for that conversation. When the hospital decides to expand a service line or change a service line, sterile processing should be at the table. And oftentimes that has to come with a title, just because hospitals have that kind of crazy hierarchy, but at some point, we as an organization and a group of professionals, infection prevention and sterile processing, have to really push that is critical, because they can add all the service lines they want in the world or all the complicated instrumentation they want in the world. If sterile processing can't do the job to get it done, it's dead in the water. They'll never get the turnover. They'll never hit the patient safety elements that most surgeons are now held to. So that's one arm of the work. Another arm is just IP being down in the space and ensuring that policies and procedures are up to date with current guidelines. I've seen where sterile processors don't even have access or love it, have to spend their own hard-earned dollars to buy access to AMI, ARN, and some of those standards. And we as a hospital can leverage infection prevention to make sure that they have access to those. It should not be out of the pockets of someone, in my opinion, who is severely underpaid to make that change. And as an infection preventionist, we oftentimes have a little bit of a budget where standards can be brought and recognized, and then really sitting down and making sure that people understand it. Also by encouraging and influencing certification in the space and making that known to leadership to ensure that we really get this to the level where they are professionals and not in the basement somewhere doing work. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, there's, I think that there's a lot of answers to that question. And, you know, we talked about pre-treatment, and I've been in hospitals where, you know, it really at the beginning of the whole process, it's, you know, the teams that are touching the instruments. And then once they, you know, go head on down to sterile processing, you know, then there's the handoff, but there really needs to be some understanding that it's everybody's job. Right. And, you know, you need to work together to really, you know, make the process as smooth and seamless as possible. And as you've noted earlier, it's all about the patient. And when there's that team aspect to it and just an understanding of responsibilities, it speaks volumes, because there's a respect across all departments and an understanding that, yes, we do have a responsibility to keep these instruments clean and moving for the next case. So absolutely. Let's see here. Can someone in SPD move up to IP?
That is a great question. I appreciate whoever put that in the chat. So as I shared in an earlier slide, let me push that to the audience, you can see, wrong one, that infection preventionists have varied background. They're not just nurses. They come from laboratory scientists and public health. But I'm also starting to see a big movement across the infection prevention world to recognize that there are other key clinicians who really function as infection preventionists in their daily work that could be great infection preventionists. And so it's really on the IPs themselves to really help our hospitals and also our professional organization recognize the importance that someone in sterile processing could lead to an IP. Not only could they teach the other IPs in the department about sterile processing, but they have an intimate knowledge and understanding of instruments and function and processing that, you know, despite all the time I've spent down there, I still would never know, because I've never spent, I mean, I'm just going to be honest, I've never spent 12 hours standing at an assembly table or standing at a decontam sink doing that work. And so, of course you can. I mean, the epitomes of decontam assembly, sterilization, storage, and handling, that crosses way outside of the IP world, or way outside outside the sterile processing world into IP. I mean, almost everything we do falls into a clean, dirty standard, and sterile processors know that intimately. So I, as a leader, would give a sterile processor just as much opportunity in infection prevention as anyone else interviewing for that position.
Great. Well, I think we're just about out of time here. Melissa, I can't thank you enough for joining us. It's been great. Again, I think there is a lot to discuss on this front. It's an ongoing discussion, and we can always do better. But yeah, this is great. And thank you so much again. Thank you, everybody out there, for joining us. And just a reminder, if you have questions for Melissa, you can always shoot them over to her via email. And if there are any unanswered questions, we'll make sure that we get those handled as well. So once again, thank you. And we will see everybody in about 15 minutes for our final session of the day. And looking forward to it. We're almost there, but it has been a wonderful day. Really appreciate everybody. Thank you.